Hello, welcome to day question mark of our reading of Sense and Sensibility. Just been working on the same essay basically all day. Sorry, trying to stack something. Yep, just been working on my essay. I technically finished it, but now I have to go edit it. And I don't really know what the professor wants, so it's anybody's game as to what's gonna happen. I'm eating strawberries. I just had lunch. I'm about to sit through a 4-hour class. Reviewing a bunch of my classmates' work, which, it's like I give them the attention and respect that I would want to receive, but it is a 4-hour class, and it can just be like, whew, 4 hours long of talking about other people's work, which is fine because I love giving notes and hearing notes and getting feedback and thinking of ways to help each other. But again, 4-hour long class of sitting in this exact spot. But it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Let's see, what time is it? Time to do our review. So, yesterday in Sense and Sensibility, Marianne and Margaret went out and took a walk, and they were like, "It's not gonna rain, guys." And Mrs. Dashwood and Eleanor were like, "It's gonna rain." And they're like, "You guys are so silly, it's not gonna rain." And then it rained. And so they're like, "Let's run down this hill." And so they started running down the hill, and Chariots of Fire is playing, and then Marianne tripped and sprained her ankle, and this very handsome gentleman came to her rescue and whisked her up in his arms and carried her back home, and everyone's like, "Oh my God." And Marianne's like, "Oh my God." And so then Marianne and this man whose name is Willoughby become very good friends, and they like all the same things, and Marianne is like, "This is love for a young girl like me." And she's 16 and this guy is 25. Which just thinking about that, just that, I don't even what would a age accurate Jane Austen adaptation look like? Horrifying. But yeah, I don't even want to what did I look like when I was 16? Baby. That's what I looked like when I was 16. Not that I'm truthfully that much older. The difference between 16 and 21 won't seem that far eventually. Yeah, crazy. But Colonel Willoughby is not Colonel. Colonel Brandon is worse. He's 35. But it's okay. I still like Colonel Brandon. But I just try not to think about that part. Yeah, so they become really close friends, and Eleanor's like, "Uh-oh, I think Colonel Brandon is definitely into Marianne," which sucks because Marianne thinks he's gross and old, and Willoughby is only exacerbating that. It's like Willoughby's like, "Ugh, I don't like this," and then Marianne all of a sudden is like, "Oh my God, you're so right. We totally don't like that," which is exactly what old guys do to young girls, which is ew. Anyways, I'm trying not to think about it, but I'm not doing very well. So let's do this. Let's see what's happening. Ooh, okay, it's starting to get a little toasty in here. Chapter 11. Little had Mrs. Dashwood or her daughters imagined when they first came into Devonshire that so many engagements would arise to occupy their time as shortly presented themselves, or that they should have such frequent invitations and such constant visitors as to leave them little leisure for serious employment. Yet such was the case. When Marianne was recovered, the schemes of amusement at home and abroad, which Sir John had been previously forming, were put in execution. The private balls at the park then began, and parties on the water were made and accomplished as often as showery October would allow. In every meeting of the kind, Willoughby was included, and the ease of familiarity which naturally attended these parties were exactly calculated to give increasing intimacy to his acquaintance with the Dashwoods, to afford him opportunity of witnessing the excellencies of Marianne, or of marking his animated admiration of her, and of receiving her, in behaviour to himself, the most pointed assurance of her affection. Eleanor could not be surprised at their attachment. She only wished that it were less openly shown, and once or twice did venture to suggest the propriety of some self-command to Marianne. But Marianne abhorred all concealment where no real disgrace could attend unreserved, and to aim at the restraint of sentiments which were not in themselves illaudable, appeared to her not merely an unnecessary effort, but a disgraceful subjection of reason to commonplace and mistaken notions. Willoughby thought the same, and their behavior at all times was an illustration of their opinions. When he was present, she had no eyes for anyone else. Everything he did was right. Everything he said was clever. If their evening at the park were concluded with cards, he cheated himself and all the rest of the party to get her a good hand. If dancing formed the amusement of the night, they were partners for half the time, and when obliged to separate for a couple of dances, were careful to stand together and scarcely spoke a word to anybody else. Such conduct made them, of course, most exceedingly laughed at, but ridicule could not shame, and seemed hardly to provoke them. Mrs. Dashwood entered into all their feelings with a warmth which left her no inclination for checking this excessive display of them. To her it was but the natural consequence of a strong affection in a young and ardent mind. This was the season of happiness to Marianne. Her heart was devoted to Willoughby, and the fond attachment to Norland, which she had brought with her from Sussex, was more likely to be softened than she had thought it possible before, by the charms which his society bestowed on her present home. Elinor's happiness was not so great. Her heart was not so much at ease, nor her satisfaction in their amusements so pure. They afforded her no companion that could make amends for what she had left behind, nor that could teach her to think of Norland with less regret than ever. Neither Lady Middleton nor Mrs. Jennings could supply to her the conversation she missed, although the latter was an everlasting talker, and from the first had regarded her with a kindness which ensured her a large share of her discourse. She had already repeated her own history to Elinor 3 or 4 times, and had Elinor's memory been equal to her means of improvement, she might have known very early in their acquaintance all the particulars of Mr. Jennings' last illness, and what he said to his wife a few minutes before he died. Lady Middleton was more agreeable than her mother, only in being more silent. Elinor needed little observation to perceive that her reserve was mere calmness of manner with which sense had nothing to do. Towards her husband and mother she was the same as to them, and intimacy was therefore neither to be looked for nor desired. She had nothing to say one day that she had not said the day before. Her insipidity was invariable, for even her spirits were always the same, and though she did not oppose the parties arranged by her husband, provided everything were conducted in style and her 2 eldest children attended her, she never appeared to receive more enjoyment from them than she might have experienced in sitting at home. And so little did her presence add to the pleasure of the others by any share in their conversation, that they were sometimes only reminded of her being amongst them by her solicitude about her troublesome boys. In Colonel Brandon alone, of all her new acquaintances, did Elinor find a person who could in any degree claim the respect of abilities, excite the interest of friendship, or give pleasure as a companion. Willoughby was out of the question. Her admiration and regard, even her sisterly regard, was all his own, but he was a lover. His attentions were wholly Marianne's, and a far less agreeable man might have been more generally pleasing. Colonel Brandon, unfortunately for himself, had no such encouragement to think only of Marianne, and in conversing with Elinor he found the greatest consolation for the total indifference of her sister. I still think they should get together, but I don't know. Elinor's compassion for him increased, as she had a reason to suspect that the misery of disappointed love had already been known by him. This suspicion was given some word which accidentally dropped from him one evening at the park, when they were sitting down together by mutual consent, while the others were dancing. His eyes were fixed on Marianne, and after a silence of some minutes he said with a faint smile, "Your sister, I understand, does not approve of second attachments." "No," replied Elinor, "her opinions are all romantic." "Or, as I believe, she considers them impossible to exist." I believe she does, but how she contrives it without reflection on the character of her own father, who had himself 2 wives, I know not. A few years, however, will settle her opinions on the reasonable basis of common sense and observation, and then they may be more easy to define and to justify than they are now by anybody but herself. This will probably be the case, he replied. And yet there is something so amiable in the prejudices of a young mind that one is sorry to see them give way to the reception of more general opinions. I cannot agree with you there, said Eleanor. There are inconveniences attending such feelings as Marianne's, which all the charms of enthusiasm and ignorance of the world cannot atone for. Her systems have all the unfortunate tendency of setting propriety at naught, and a better acquaintance with the world is what I look forward to as her greatest possible advantage. After a short pause, he resumed the conversation by saying, Does your sister make no distinction in her objections against a second attachment? Or is it equally criminal in everybody? Are those who have been disappointed in their first choice, whether from the inconstancy of its object or the perverseness of circumstances, to be equally indifferent during the rest of their lives? Upon my word, I am not acquainted with the minutiae of her principles. I only know that I never heard her yet admit any instance of a second's attachments being pardonable. This, said he, cannot hold. But a total change of sentiments. No, do not desire it. For when the romantic refinements of a young mind are obliged to give way, how frequently are they succeeded by such opinions as are but too common and too dangerous. I speak from experience. I once knew a lady who in temper and mind greatly resembled your sister, who thought and judged like her, but who from an enforced change, from a series of unfortunate circumstances. Here he stopped suddenly, appeared to think that he had said too much, and by his countenance gave rise to conjectures which might not otherwise have entered Eleanor's head. The lady would probably have passed without suspicion had he not convinced Miss Dashwood that what concerned her ought not to escape his lips. As it was, it required but a slight effort of fancy to connect his emotion with the tender recollection of past regard. Eleanor attempted no more, but Marianne, in her place, would not have done so little. The whole story would have been speedily formed under her active imagination, and everything established in the most melancholy order of disastrous love. I really identify with Colonel Brandon. He's a little bit sad. He's pretty sad. I like it. I like sad boys. Chapter 12. As Eleanor and Marianne were walking together the next morning, the latter communicated a piece of news to her sister, which, in spite of all that she knew before of Marianne's imprudence and want of thought, surprised her by its extravagant testimony of both. Marianne told her, with the greatest delight, that Willoughby had given her a horse, one that he had bred himself on his estate in Somersetshire, which was exactly calculated to carry a woman. Without considering that it was not her mother's plan to keep any horse, that if she were to alter her resolution in favor of this gift, she must buy another for the servant, and keep a servant to ride it, and after all build a stable to receive them, she had accepted the present without hesitation, and told her sister of it in raptures. Damn, what's a horse, what's the equivalent? Is it like a car? Is that the equivalent? In, this guy I've been flirting with gave me a car. Damn. He intends to send his groom into Somersetshire immediately for it, she added, and when it arrives we will ride every day. You shall share its use with me. Imagine yourself, my dear Eleanor, the delight of a gallop on some of these downs. Most unwilling was she to awaken from such a dream of felicity, to comprehend all the unhappy truths which attended the affair, and for some time she refused to submit to them. As to an additional servant, the expense would be a trifle. Mamma, she was sure, would never object to it, and any horse would do for him. He might always get one at the park. As to a stable, the mere shed would be sufficient. Eleanor then ventured to doubt the propriety of her receiving such a present from a man so little, or at least so lately, known to her. This was too much. "You are mistaken, Eleanor," she said warmly, "in supposing I know very little of Willoughby. I have known him long indeed, but I am much better acquainted with him than I am with any other creature in the world, except yourself and mamma. It is not time nor opportunity that is to determine intimacy. It is disposition alone. 7 years would be insufficient to make some people acquainted with each other, and 7 days are more than enough for others. I should hold myself guilty of greater impropriety in accepting a horse from my brother than from Willoughby. Of John I know very little, though we have lived together for years, but of Willoughby my judgment has long been formed." I guess, yeah, maybe a bicycle, but like a really nice bike. Maybe like an electric scooter, which is like, that's a lot, but it's really helpful. Um, Eleanor thought it wisest to touch that point no more. She knew her sister's temper. Opposition on so tender a subject would only attach her the more of her own opinion. But by an appeal to her affection for her mother, by representing the inconveniences which that indulgent mother must draw on herself if, as would probably be the case, she consented to this increase of establishment, Marianne was shortly subdued, and she promised not to tempt her mother to such imprudent kindness by mentioning the offer, and to tell Willoughby when she saw him next that it must be declined. She was faithful to her word, and when Willoughby called at the cottage the same day, Eleanor heard her express her disappointment to him in a low voice, on being obliged to forego the acceptance of his present. The reasons for this alteration were at the same time related, and they were such as to make further entreaty on his side impossible. His concern, however, was very apparent, and after expressing it with earnestness, he added in the same low voice, "But, Marianne, the horse is still yours, though you cannot use it now. I shall keep it only until you can claim it. When you leave Barton to form your own establishment, in a more lasting home Queen Mab shall receive you." This was all overheard by Miss Dashwood, and in the whole of the sentence, in his manner of pronouncing it, and in his addressing her sister by her Christian name alone, she instantly saw an intimacy so decided, a meaning so direct as marked a perfect agreement between them. From that moment she doubted not of their being engaged to each other, and the belief of it created no other surprise than that she or any of their friends should be left by tempers so frank to discover it by accident. A Vespa, you're right. um, Margaret related something to her the next day, which placed this matter in a still clearer light. Willoughby had spent the preceding evening with them, and Margaret, by being left some time in the parlour with only him and Marianne, had had the opportunity for observations which, with a most important face, she communicated to her elder sister when they were next by themselves. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "I have such a secret to tell you about Marianne. I am sure she will be married to Mr. Willoughby very soon." "You have said so," replied Eleanor, "almost every day since they first met on High Church Down, and they had not known each other a week, I believe, before you were certain that Marianne wore his picture round her neck, but it turned out only to be a miniature of our great uncle." "But indeed this is quite another thing. I am sure they will be married very soon, for he has got a lock of her hair." "Take care, Margaret. It may only be the hair of some great uncle of his." "But indeed, Eleanor, it is Marianne's. I am almost sure it is, for I saw him cut it off last night after tea, when you and mamma went out of the room. They were whispering and talking together as fast as could be, and he seemed to be begging something of her, and presently he took up her scissors and cut off a long lock of her hair, for it was all tumbled down her back, and he kissed it, and folded it up in a piece of white paper, and put it into his pocket-book." From such particulars stated on such authority, Eleanor could not withhold her credit, nor was she disposed to it, for the circumstance was in perfect unison with what she had heard and seen herself. Margaret's sagacity was not always displayed in a way so satisfactory to her sister. When Mrs. Jennings attacked her one evening at the park to give the name of the young man who was Eleanor's particular favourite, which had been long a matter of great curiosity to her, Margaret answered by looking at her sister and saying, "I must not tell, may I, Eleanor?" This, of course, made everybody laugh, and Eleanor tried to laugh too. But the effort was painful. She was convinced that Margaret had fixed on a person whose name she could not bear with composure to become a standing joke with Mrs. Jennings. Baby. Marianne felt for her most sincerely, but she did more harm than good to the cause by turning very red and saying in an angry manner to Margaret, "Remember what your conjectures may be. You have no right to repeat them." "I never had any conjectures about it," replied Margaret. "It was you who told me of it yourself." This increased the mirth of the company, and Margaret was eagerly pressed to say something more. "Oh, pray, Miss Margaret, let us know all about it," says Mrs. Jennings. "What is the gentleman's name?" "I must not tell, ma'am, but I know very well what it is, and I know where he is, too." "Yes, yes, we can guess where he is, at his own house at Norland, to be sure. He is the curate of the parish, I dare say." "No, not that he is not. He is of no profession at all." Margaret, said Marianne with great warmth, "you know that all this is an invention of your own, and that there is no such person in existence." "Well, then he is lately dead, Marianne, for I am sure there was such a man once, and his name begins with an F." "Margaret!" Most grateful did Elinor feel to Lady Middleton for observing at this moment that it rained very hard, though she believed that the interruption to proceed less from any attention to her than from her ladyship's great dislike of all such inelegant subjects of raillery as delighted her husband and mother. The idea, however, started by her, was immediately pursued by Colonel Brandon, who was on every occasion mindful to the feelings of others. Colonel Brandon is a dish. And much was said on the subject of rain by both of them. Willoughby opened the pianoforte and asked Marianne to sit down to it, and thus amidst the various endeavours of different people to quit the topic, it fell to the ground. But not so easily did Elinor recover from the alarm into which it had thrown her. A party was formed this evening for going on the following day to see a very fine place about 12 miles from Barton, belonging to a brother-in-law of Colonel Brandon, without whose interest it could not be seen, as the proprietor, who was then abroad, had left strict orders on that head. The grounds were declared to be highly beautiful, and Sir John, who was particularly warm in their praise, might be allowed to be a tolerable judge, for he had formed parties to visit them at least twice every summer for the last 10 years. They contained a noble piece of water, a sail on which was to form a great part of the morning's amusement. Cold provisions were to be taken, open carriages only to be employed, and everything conducted in the usual style of a complete party of pleasure. To some view of the company, it appeared rather a bold undertaking, considering the time of year, and that it had rained every day for the last fortnight, and Mrs. Dashwood, who had already a cold, was persuaded by Elinor to stay at home. And that's the end of the chapter. Interesting. Wow, Colonel Brandon and Elinor are both sad, and I want them to be sad together. But I think this is a ship that will not sail because Colonel Brandon is into Marianne for reasons beyond my understanding. Brandon, listen, she's a young girl. She doesn't know what she's doing. This is not the match for you, my friend. Well, you live and you let live. I don't think that's a saying. All right, I'm going to head out for today. I will see you tomorrow for chapters 13 and 14. And we will continue getting this ship on the road. It has been good to see you and to talk with you. I cannot wait to read your little comments, John. And I will see you tomorrow. Tomorrow is Friday, so at 3. Woohoo! All right, see you guys tomorrow at 3. Bye-bye.